horses are extremely good athletes. So if we are not able to get as much air in, that horse won't have as much oxygen to supply all its muscles and will highly likely suffer from reduced performance.
Welcome to the first episode of AgriFutures' New Look podcast, Unearthed, the people changing Australian agriculture. When big ideas and new opportunities run up against established farming practices in Australia's unique environment, there's some tough choices to be made. This podcast is all about unearthing those farmers, scientists, and big characters who have found a new path to a more profitable, productive, and resilient future for Australian agriculture. I'm your host, Michael Thompson, and to get the series off to a fast start, we're off to the races. Our favourite horse is on the home stretch coming down the straight. We're 200 out and half a length in front when suddenly our jockey hears a loud roaring sound coming from the throat of his horse. Josie Hardwick, thoroughbred veterinarian, equine surgeon and researcher with both Murdoch University and Adelaide University. What is going on and what happens next?
Well, it could be many things, Michael. It could be most likely thing if it's making an abnormal breathing noise, particularly when it's breathing inwards. And we hear that loud, harsh, roaring sound, is that it could have developed clinical laryngeal dysfunction, colloquially known as the horse being a roarer. And the scientific term for that is recurrent laryngeal neuropathy. We would diagnose, or the first step we would do would be to perform a resting endoscopic exam on that horse by inserting a video endoscope up its nose and then evaluating those laryngeal movements at rest.
So that's after the race. So during the race, though, we can assume that it's not breathing so well, going to fall to the back of the pack?
Typically, yes, if we have a horse that is a true roarer, the left side of that horse's throat, the left arytenoid cartilage, will be unable to maintain abduction, so the horse won't be able to keep that cartilage fully open.
In this episode, we're tackling the question of roaring in thoroughbreds, or to be more precise, diagnosing thoroughbreds with laryngeal neuropathy. As we heard at the opening, the condition constricts the airways and restricts the flow of oxygen, which is kind of important when a horse is running as fast as it can. Horse racing is a big money industry around the world, and in Australia it injects more than $9 billion a year into the national economy. So there's plenty at stake for breeders, owners, trainers, and punters alike, all of whom would rather that their horse was running freely and without the restrictions of laryngeal neuropathy.
With the condition, if the horse is classed as a roarer, then those horses generally won't be brought to the auction, just through the process that people are not going to buy those horses at the auction, and they'll have to. The farm will either give that horse more time and hope that it changes, or it might have to have surgery to help correct that.
That's Craig Rounsfeld. He's the director of Boomer Bloodstock and president of the Federation of Bloodstock Agents of Australia. He deals with top shelf breeders and buyers from all around the globe to help them find the right horse for their needs at the big money sales, such as the Magic Millions here in Australia.
So you've got leading up to a sale. There's before you get to the sale grounds, there's a lot of research that takes place. So you're in the office and going through a lot of statistics and other data that's available. And then once you get to the sales, there's that inspection process. So that's where the experience of, knowing the confirmation of a horse, what you're looking for based on the various aspects of what clients you might have. Some, clients have different budgets, different, types of horses they're wanting. So you're doing that inspection process to, narrow that down for your client, to give them a sale that might have 1,000 horses. You might narrow that 1,000 down to, 10 or 20 for them to look at. And then on us leading up, then gets to the pointy end of the sale, you're doing the veterinary work, that pre-sale vetting to make sure that your veterinarian's happy with, the condition of the horse and the different aspects of the x-rays and scopes and other things involved there with the physical inspection. And then on sale, you're working with your client to determine budgets, what they're prepared to bid up to on a horse, and then guide them through that process. And the horse comes into the ring, and there's also nuances there with how you're bidding and navigating the that process of when the horse is in the ring and the bidding, and there's a bit of experience that takes place there to secure the horse for your client. And then
And even afterwards, there's another layer of double checking, isn't there?
correct. There's after you buy the horse, there's that post-sale scope of a yearling.
The scope Craig is referring to is short for an endoscope or an endoscopy. You may have heard doctors talk about endoscopies as it's the same process used on humans. A thin, flexible tube with a light and camera is inserted into the body to allow the doctor, or in the horse's case the vet, to view the interior of an organ or cavity.
Typically, they will undergo a scope or a resting endoscopic exam at least once prior to even going to the sales. These farms only want to take a good product to the sales, so they want to screen out any yearling that they feel is already showing early signs of disease.
As Dr. Josie Hardwick explains, each thoroughbred offered at sale is again subject to a strict veterinary assessment prior to entering the auction ring.
Yearlings undergo what we call a pre-sale endoscopic exam, which is done when they arrive at the sales complex before the sale. That video is uploaded into a repository, as are many of they're all radiographed as well. They radiograph many of their joints to look for any signs of developmental orthopedic disease. And then prospective purchasers get their veterinarians to look at these videos.
Okay, so I can imagine that that's not a desirable trait that a buyer or a trainer would want in their animals if they're at the sale ring.
Purchasers of thoroughbred yearlings want to reduce the risk of buying any yearling with an increased risk of disease or that's going to have a problem that may affect its performance once it gets to the racetrack. And one of the things they are screened for is horses that show they're at increased risk of developing this disease in the future.
It's estimated that about 9% of thoroughbreds will develop clinical laryngeal dysfunction. Up until the start of this year, vets had been using the 5-point Lane-Bain-Fallon scale to grade the likelihood that a yearling has or will develop in the future laryngeal neuropathy. Horses rated a 1 were considered very low risk. As you can imagine, they are in high demand at the sales. Horses rated 2 were almost as low risk, so no troubles there either. Horses rated 4 and 5 wouldn't even be offered for sale, as the risk of roaring is considered far too high. But in the middle of it all, there was a murky land of the horses that were rated score 3.
The grade 3 out of 5, and they're the ones that everyone was concerned about, that those, if a yearling was identified as a grade 3, they were fetching lower sales prices, and some of them didn't even sell at all, so lower clearance rates. And there was a concern that it was only a small percentage of those grade 3s that actually went on and had reduced performance, and not all grade 3s needed a tieback at the end of the day, but they were all being tarred with the same brush.
A tieback is the common name for the surgery that can be undertaken to repair the laryngeal function so that thoroughbreds can continue racing. But success is not guaranteed from the surgery, and surgery costs money, so it's much better if you can avoid it altogether by purchasing a low-risk animal.
1s and 2s, everybody was more than happy with those. Initially like with X-rays, as everyone wanted a 1, but as research developed, people understood that the grade 1 and 2 is very similar. It's splitting hairs in some instances, whereas the grade 3, it did definitely have a bit of a stigma attached, and say for various clients, they just weren't interested in buying 3s, even though that a 3 meets conditions of sale, and there's a number of successful cases out there of horses that were 3s at the sale didn't reach the potential of what they should have made based on that scope, and got on to perform well.
Yeah. Okay, so but that's an important point, that just because a horse is ranked 3, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good horse, does it? It's just it's a risk assessment, a likelihood of having respiratory issues in the future, isn't it?
From what I can ascertain is that, they've still got a high level of chance of performing in those early years. The longevity of that throat is where the problems lie. They're much more likely to need a tieback surgery, which in effect will reduce performance. So it's there's a lot of people out there in the marketplace that will still happily buy those horses, and they're getting a discount. So that's where it's factored in. With horses, there's no certainty, complete certainty. So you have to manage risk, and people have different levels of risk. Those that are willing to, have a higher propensity to risk, they'll do that if they're getting a discount. So that is something to factor in, and it just depends on the client that you're operating for.
I guess a good recent example of that was the horse Nepotism, which I understand was scored a grade 3 last year in the old system, and this year has, it's made a lot of money for its owners, winning the Group 1 Champagne Stakes in Sydney only a month or so ago. I guess that's part of the magic of racing, isn't it? That you still have those magical moments. But in the scheme of things, we're trying to provide that, best bet, I guess, to make that informed decision around risk, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. We actually that horse in question, he was from a lot of differing opinions at the sale grounds. Everyone was pretty much on the fact that he was a 3, so at the lower end of that 3 scale. But there were, again, differing opinions. There was one of the FBAA members, Mark Player, his veterinarian, obviously gave him the advice that it was worth the discount that he was receiving. He was a beautiful horse. He was a magnificent horse from a huge family, Black Caviar and Ole Kirk and that family. So, again, that he had a client that was willing to take the risk, and they've been handsomely rewarded. So there's a number of cases like that. It's like we've spoken about, there's no certainty, complete certainty with horses, and that's the beauty of the game. The good horse can overcome perceived issues.
But like you say, if you're about to part with a decent chunk of money, I mean, it's a high stakes sport, isn't it? A high cost sport. You want to make an informed decision. I'm wondering though, amongst buyers, particularly buyers who may be coming from a background where they don't have that knowledge, that detailed knowledge of animal husbandry, how important is this in articulating to them levels of risk so they can make a comfortable decision based on their level of knowledge?
I think it's from an agent's point of view, it's about explaining that to the client, understanding the client's goals, their level of risk, what they're trying to achieve.
So what did industry do about the troublesome number 3s, which could look vastly different to one another under a scope? That was the problem AgriFutures and Dr. Josie Hardwick had to solve for the Australian thoroughbred industry.
And that's why we looked at the Havermeyer grading system, because it splits those grade 3s.
The Havermeyer scale is a 7-point scale for grading laryngeal function and makes a clearer distinction between the horses at the top end of the troublesome score 3 and those at the bottom. The Havermeyer system itself isn't new. It's been in use all around the world for decades now, but for some reason Australia has held out.
I think it's just we didn't have the data to warrant moving to that scale. There'd just been no sort of robust studies done on it, and it's an awful lot of work. We've been going for quite a few years on this, so it's not something that can just go, let's change it. You have to have some evidence to make change, which is why it was so great that AgriFutures could come on board and support us to do this project, because without funding for these projects, this stuff doesn't happen.
As I understand it, you went and reviewed the performance of literally thousands of horses over a couple of years and their performance on the track relative to their scales.
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at the yearling sales scopes of over 5,000 horses, and then we followed up their race performance and split that into their 2-year-old performance, 3-year-old and 4-year-old plus performance, and also total career performance. And there were over, I think, 32 different performance metrics for each horse as well, and then correlated or looked at the association between the yearling laryngeal function grade they were assigned and how that went on. And obviously there's lots of factors involved in performance, hence why we had to look at so many to make sure that our findings were valid.
Now, before we get to the results of that study, we need to clear something up. The Havermeyer scale has 7 different scores for laryngeal function, but the scale itself, somewhat confusingly, is numbered from 1 to 4, with subgroups for grades 2 and 3. On the old scale, grade 1 horses are still grade 1 on the Havermeyer scale. Grade 2 horses are now ranked as 2.1. The old Grade 3s are now split, with the better horses rated 2.2 and the higher risk horses rated 3.1. Sounds logical, right? Well, when you see the results, it actually makes a lot of sense.
So what we found with those horses is we didn't actually find that the grade 2.2s had reduced performance compared to the grade 1s and 2.1s. So they still performed as well as a grade 1 and 2.1 throughout their career. What we did find in another study we did was that the grade 2.2s had a slightly increased risk of needing a tieback compared to those grade 1s. So but we'd say 6 to 7% of grade 1 and 2.1s will need a tieback at the end of the day. So the risk is not zero, even if you buy a grade 1 and a 2.1, but they have a reduced risk. Whereas a grade 2.2, their risk will be around about 14% of grade 2.2s will unfortunately develop clinical disease requiring a tieback at some point. So slightly increased risk of that, but we couldn't find any difference in their performance. So we'd classify those as sort of a low to moderate risk. But we're talking about 14%, so you still got 86% chance it's not going to need a tieback, and we couldn't split their performance. So I'd classify that as quite unlikely to happen. And when we're talking about 3.1, so they were in the original grade 3 out of 5 category, it's actually only 4% of the yearling draft or the yearling population are going to be a grade 3.1. So very, very small number of animals are going to have grade 3.1 laryngeal function at the sales. So that's important to think about. It's 95% are going to have grade 1, 2.1 or 2.2 yearling laryngeal function. So 95% of the yearlings at the sale are going to be in that sort of lower risk categories. But the grade 3.1s, they would be the old grade 3s that people were concerned about. And what we found with those is that they still performed the same as a grade 1 and a 2.1 in their 2 and 3 year old race careers. Some of the grade, some of them as a 2-year-old actually performed really, really well. But what happened when they got to their 4-year-old plus race careers is we found that their on average, anyway, their performance was reduced, and on average, they earned $35,000 less than the grade 1 and 2.1 categories.
So what does all this mean on sale day? Well, it really depends on the buyer.
You might have a client that's buying a filly that they're looking to race, but then they're also wanting to breed from that filly in the future. That's a completely different case to someone that's buying a colt that they want to take to Hong Kong. So, you have to weigh up what the client's trying to achieve, their goals, and then also the horse in front of you. You've got, if you've got a big colt, big heavy colt with a longer neck, and he's, falling into the 3 scale, 2.2, 3.1, you're probably not going to feel as comfortable recommending that horse to the client, and in my opinion, you'd be advising the client to restrict, as opposed to a filly, a really light athletic filly. I'd be more inclined to take the risk if the client was in that wheelhouse to get the discount in that lower level and take the risk. But it's very much client dependent, and also the physical of the horse and the genetics. There's certain lines, whether it be stallions or families that have had wind problems, throat problems in the past, and you have to take that into account, those sort of things as well. And that's where you explain all these factors to the client before they can make an informed decision.
The opportunity to provide clearer, objective information through the use of the Habermeyer system has been jumped upon by the thoroughbred industry, which in some circles has a reputation as being a little bit resistant to change. The results of Josie Hardwick's study were released only in mid-2024, and by January 2025, the major yearling sales across Australia and New Zealand were all using the new Habermeyer scale.
I think, like with all things, the thoroughbred industry is a slow-moving beast. It's change is always met with some sort of resistance. So I think, when you have these studies and you can show with actual facts from a large study, then the case to make change is, very straightforward. It has to happen, really. So the veterinarians, for whatever reason, or the industry itself took a while to come to this place, but I think everyone would agree that it's the right move. And also it creates, with this international landscape now, when international buyers are coming in with the veterinarians here in Australia, we're all on the same page.
A key to the rapid adoption of the new system has been the involvement of the breeders and agents in the research process right from the very beginning.
We went forth with an AgriFutures funded this study to do some stakeholder engagement with the different parts of the industry. So we talked to breeders, we talked to purchasers, whether they were trainers or they were bloodstock agents or owners, and also equine sales vets to come together.
How critical was that step in resultant sort of outcome of having the industry buy in and really take on board what you were working on?
I think it's absolutely vital that we make sure, as researchers and academics, and we all, our whole research team also do clinical work as well, and see and treat these horses. But if we don't bring everyone along, it's harder to, the impact of the research impact is lessened because people aren't as invested in it. And we also need to make sure we're investigating the right problem, not the problem that we think is happening. So
that's a common criticism of the world of academia and research, that, disconnected from reality. But that's something that AgriFutures takes a lot of pride in, isn't it? Making sure that its research it has impact.
Absolutely. And it was there. They were very much on board with doing this stakeholder engagement from the get-go. They felt it was extremely important.
So where to from here? Josie has now shifted her focus to clearing up that confounding question of how to communicate the 7 points between numbers 1 and 4 on the Habermeyer scale.
And we completely understand that there's a lot of different grades flying around, and not everybody's familiar with these grading systems outside of the equine veterinary community. What we can say is, so when we look at horses' radiographs at sale, so these yearling radiographs are given different degrees of risk. So they'll get given low risk, a moderate risk, or a high risk for purchase. And that's quite simple, isn't it? People can understand that. So we've done the same thing with these yearling scopes. So we can say that if the yearling has a grade 1 or a 2-1 throat, they are low risk. So these sale vets will be able to say this is low risk. Doesn't really matter what grade it is, because it needs to, those grades can be confusing in that some people might have thought that a grade 1 was better than a grade 2-1, and that's not the case if you look at the research. It's just, as humans, we like to put grades and categories on things, but it doesn't always explain what we see clinically or in their performance or anything else. So grade 1 and 2-1, they are just low risks.
For now, though, as we near the finishing post of our great endoscopy research race, the benefits are already being felt by the racing industry.
I think the AgriFutures research program into the respiratory function has been a massive positive for the thoroughbred breeding industry. And as a bloodstock agent, it's created so many more opportunities for buying for international clients and domestically because of this work.
You've been listening to Unearthed, the people changing Australian agriculture. If you enjoy the New Look AgriFutures podcast, please leave a rating on your podcast platform. Next time on Unearthed, we're going behind the scenes of the largest annual movement of livestock in Australia. No, we're not talking about a great cattle drive, we're not talking about sheep, and we're not even talking about goats. We're talking about the movement of more than 6 billion European honeybees to Australia's almond orchards each year to deliver pollination services. And we need to know what's going on inside those hives so that we can ensure the future of Australia's honeybee industry. Discover what we find out in our next episode of Unearthed, the people changing Australian agriculture.